Welcome, curious traveler of time and tales. Settle in with a warm cup of something herbal, preferably one that doesn't promise a miraculous cure, and imagine yourself stepping into a world where sickness wasn't a problem solved by pill bottles and clinical trials, but a terrifying, mysterious force lurking just beyond the grasp of understanding. Here, life was fragile, patchy, and often brief, as vulnerable as a candle flame flickering in a draught. Before microscopes and methods, before even the word medicine carried its modern weight, there was only the wild desperation of humanity staring down the invisible harbingers of death. Fevers that raged like wildfire, wounds festering in the dirt, coughs that rattled lungs like a death knell. How do you battle something you can't see or don't fully understand? Well, you get creative. You call in the magic. You whisper to the herbs. You cling to hope with trembling hands. It's a world where the line between the natural and supernatural blurred so comfortably you might trip over it. Illness didn't just happen. It was a curse, a punishment from vengeful gods offended by your ancestors' blasphemy, or maybe a spiteful spirit out for a laugh. The Romans might drape themselves in the ominous silence of temples, sacrificing animals to appease gods, hoping the smoke signals sent heavenward would turn aside invisible demons, sabotaging their insides. Elsewhere, shamans danced, tranced into worlds unseen, chanting spells woven with roots and barks, their voices echoing ancient truths nobody in their right mind would dare question. It's tempting to scoff at these early remedies, right? But imagine for a moment, you're lying in the dirt with a fever so high it feels like your brain is a fried egg on a skillet, and no one knows exactly how or why. You're clutching leaves or bitter barks someone handed you because they looked like something else in the shape of the body part that hurt, or because a jungle vine called Death's Ally sounded suitably intimidating. Maybe that old woman in the village swears by her concoctions, though her breath smells like the grave. If hope is all you have, you take it. Herbs were the first pharmacy, the ancient crowd-sourced wisdom of our ancestors distilled into bitter teas and smelly poultices. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, was crushed and brewed to ease pain and reduce fevers, long before we recognized what was inside. Poppies, in all their narcotic splendor, offered relief from agony and breaths of sweet oblivion. Garlic, stubborn and pungent, was believed to ward off not just vampires, that's later folklore, but still, but spirits and plagues too. The knowledge was patchy, passed by word of mouth, guarded jealously like treasure. But it wasn't just about plants. The human body itself was a battleground of forces, a delicate balance of humors, blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. If these four mysterious fluids were out of whack, you'd suffer. The answer? Leeches and bleeding, puking and purging. The ancient doctor, wielding his tools like a medieval barber doing his morning routine, might drain your blood by the cupful, convinced that spilling it was the way to restore health. The crackle of bones set by splinters of magic and faith, the scorching of skin with heated irons meant to exorcise evil symptoms. This was the cutting edge. To think of it now feels almost comedic. But back then it was real life, a matter of survival. Most babies wouldn't see their 5th birthday, and even those who made it faced dangers lurking everywhere, from contaminated water that today's sanitation systems banish with a flick of a tap, to infections that modern antibiotics can treat in a dose or two. Life was short, brutal, unreliable. Many believed you were born with a destiny marked in your blood and bones, but disease could rewrite that fate at a moment's notice. So how did people cope? If you can't fix it outright, you fight fire with fire, or at least with power that felt bigger than you. If the illness was a demon, then a ritual, a charm, a sacrifice might chase it away. Masks, amulets, and prayers were as vital as the roots in the herbal pouch. No hospital could beat the fire and brimstone confidence of a healer who, with a wild gleam in the eye, promised the gods favor in exchange for obedience, ritual, and offerings. Chickens were not spared, sometimes whole herds. In this primal dance with disease, knowledge grew slowly, tangled with myth and superstition. The sacred and the scientific were locked in an uneasy embrace. Sometimes, by sheer luck or observation, a practice worked, or seemed to. People noticed that honey helped wounds heal, that bitter teas eased fevers, that clean water, while mystical, had an oddly helpful effect. The first threads of empirical wisdom wove themselves into a tapestry framed by magic. And magic itself was a double-edged sword. On one hand, superstition could trap people in terrifying cycles of blame and fear. Witch hunts, scapegoats, the innocent sacrificed to calm communal panic. But it also gave people agency, a sense of control in a chaotic world. To believe in cures, charms, and friendly spirits was to grasp hope, and hope, perhaps, was the most potent remedy of all. So here we are, peering out from the distant shadows of prehistory, where every bruise and cough was a story, a warning, and a plea. Each poultice and prayer carried the weight of survival. Life was short, yes, and the remedies were strange and imperfect, but they were ours. Our first attempts to understand the mountains of suffering that surrounded us, to wrestle the unknown into something manageable, something human. In those early days, where illness was battled with leaves and magic, against a backdrop of short, uncertain lives, we find the roots of a truth that still matters, that healing is as much about hope as it is about science. And though we laugh now at the leeches and chants, those first struggles laid the foundations for everything that came after. They remind us that behind every cure is a story, sometimes desperate, sometimes wild, always profoundly human. Imagine a world where a cough isn't just a nuisance, but a potential death sentence, where a fever can topple teens, and the lurking shadows of disease are as mysterious as the night itself. Long before the age of pharmaceuticals and sterile hospitals, humanity faced illness with little more than hope, nature, and a dash of magic. Welcome to the era when herbal remedies were the frontline warriors against death, and healing was an art deeply entwined with the sacred. Step into the dusty, sun-baked cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wasn't just the birthplace of writing and law. It was where humankind first documented the secrets of plants as medicines. Here, clay tablets etched with cuneiform script reveal a surprisingly sophisticated knowledge of herbal lore. But these weren't simple shopping lists of plants. No, they were recipes combining botany with incantations, where the line between medicine and magic blurred into an inseparable whole. Picture this: a Sumerian healer, robes dusted with powdered herbs, chanting prayers to gods both fierce and fickle, while carefully mixing crushed roots and leaves into a paste or poultice. The rationale: illness wasn't just a physical imbalance, but a spiritual attack, a curse or demon invading the body. So the treatments needed to address both realms: the tangible plant's healing compounds and the intangible force of divine favor. Take the mandrake root, for example, fabled in myths and feared in reality. Mesopotamian physicians might use its narcotic properties to dull pain, but only after a ritual exorcism to appease the plant's spirit, because taking it incorrectly was believed to invite madness or death. Far from the sterile labs of modern pharmacies, these ancient apothecaries were part botanist, part shaman, part stage magician, performers in a drama where life and death depended on a blend of plant chemistry and otherworldly negotiations. Shift your gaze west toward the Nile, where Egypt dazzled under a relentless sun, and where medicine and magic danced an even more elaborate tango. Egyptians had an astonishingly advanced understanding of herbal medicine, documented in papyrus scrolls that survive millennia later. The Ebers Papyrus, dating back to around 1550 BCE, reads like an ancient health handbook filled with remedies that sound eerily familiar: honey to fight infection, willow bark for pain relief, the very compound that centuries later would inspire aspirin. Yet this was no ordinary script. It was laced with spells, prayers, and invocations to gods like Isis and Thoth, whose favor was deemed essential for the healing process. Illness was conceived as disruption, a cosmic imbalance, or the work of malicious spirits. Remedies didn't merely target symptoms, but sought to restore harmony between the patient, the gods, and the natural world. A sick person might receive herbal ointments infused with frankincense or myrrh, while a priest-physician intoned spells to ward off evil forces. Magic was medicine. Medicine was magic. And sometimes the line between faith healer and pharmacist was so blurry it might as well have been painted with henna. In their bustling marketplaces and temple gardens, Egyptians cultivated a botanical pharmacopoeia that included garlic, known not just for flavor, but as a potion against parasites and heart troubles. Somehow, this pungent bulb was also a symbol of strength and protection for the laborers building the pyramids, combining practical health benefits with social magic. So, the act of healing wasn't just about curing the sick. It was about reinforcing social order and cosmic stability. If you think your modern prescription feels a little impersonal, imagine a remedy that needed a blessing from a god before you could pop that pill. Meanwhile, thousands of miles east, in the misty valleys of early China, herbal medicine was taking root with a uniquely holistic vibe. The earliest Chinese medical texts aren't just lists of plants. They are poems, philosophies, and detailed observations of the body's intricate dance with nature's rhythms. This was the birth of traditional Chinese medicine, where healing was a matter of balancing yin and yang, the opposing forces that governed health and illness. The same plant might warm or cool the body, depending on the patient's condition, and the healer's job was part diagnosis, part philosopher, part spiritual guide. Investment in herbal knowledge here wasn't casual. The Chinese emperors established imperial medical academies, where physicians studied carefully catalogued herbal properties, prescribing from a pharmacopoeia of hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products. Ginseng, the root that looks more like a little person than a vegetable, was prized not just for its invigorating properties, but because it embodied the principle of qi, the vital life force. Consuming ginseng was believed to boost the body's energy while harmonizing one's spirit. Talk about multitasking remedies. Healing rituals were complex affairs. A patient might be treated with herbal decoctions brewed over hours, accompanied by acupuncture or moxibustion, burning dried mugwort herb near specific points on the body to direct the flow of energy. And all of this underpinned by philosophical texts like the Huangdi Neijing, which compared the body's meridians and internal organs to a vast, interconnected landscape, one that required both physical and spiritual cartography to navigate illness successfully. What's striking across these early civilizations is the sheer overlap of botany and belief. Plants were not mere chemical compounds. They were gifts from gods, housing spirits or cosmic energies. To harvest, prepare, and administer them demanded ritual knowledge as much as empirical skill. It wasn't until much later that medicine began to shed its mystical skin and take on the purely scientific ethos we recognize today. Still, these ancient healers' work was astonishing when you consider their environments: crowded cities with limited sanitation, seasonal food shortages, and frequent famines that kept human lifespans painfully brief. An average Mesopotamian might live barely past 35 years. Egyptians and early Chinese likely faced similar grim odds. Every cure mattered, even if it was wrapped in superstition and chant. And yet, within these harsh realities, early herbalists carved out a form of hope. Imagine tending a patient, knowing full well death lurked nearby. But armed with leaves, roots, and prayers, you stood a chance. Herbal remedies were the medicines of possibility, fragile beats against the relentless drum of disease and decay. Their recipes, passed down on clay, papyrus, and bamboo, might seem crude by today's standards, but they were the launching pads for centuries of medical evolution. So the next time you pop a vitamin or soothe a cold with a dash of ginger tea, remember this journey. The story of herbal medicine is as ancient as civilization itself, a blend of science, magic, and belief, working hand in hand in the shadow of short, precarious lives. It teaches us that healing is not just about curing bodies, but also about nurturing the spirit, weaving stories in rituals that transform pain into something bearable, and sometimes, just sometimes, miraculous. Imagine lying sick in a dimly lit hut, the faint crackle of a dying fire your only company. Your skin crawls with fever, your breath shallow and desperate, while all around you shadows dance, cast by flickering flames and the writhing leaves of strange, pungent herbs hanging from the rafters. Somewhere nearby, a figure shrouded in animal skins and painted with strange symbols chants in a language older than memory, calling on unseen forces to wrest your soul back from the grip of illness. It sounds like a scene from a fantasy novel, right? But for thousands of years, it was the front line of medicine, the intersection of belief, desperation, and hope. Long before white-coated doctors and sterile hospitals, healing was as much about magic as it was about medicine. Shamans, medicine women, priests, and other spiritual specialists weren't just community caregivers. They were the bridge between the tangible world and the mystic unknown. Their prescriptions, not just herbs and roots, but incantations, talismans, and ritual dances designed to outwit spirits, curses, and misfortune itself, because in those ancient minds, illness didn't just come from bugs or bad luck. It was a betrayal by invisible, often malevolent forces lurking just beneath the surface of reality. This wasn't a quaint superstition, but a deeply ingrained worldview. The boundaries between the natural and supernatural were porous. Plants weren't just plants, they were gifts from the gods, alive with spirits or magic. The ailments themselves were often seen as punishments, possession by evil entities, or the result of broken taboos. And if you think that sounds grim, consider this. Life expectancy hovered around the mid-30s, sometimes even shorter. Infant mortality was devastatingly common. Death hung close, always lurking behind the next cough or fever. So, what exactly did these mystical healers do? They concocted potions, yes, but these weren't just any old teas. The preparation was ritualized, a delicate process that intertwined meticulous botanical knowledge with prayers, chants, and offerings. The timing mattered too. Certain phases of the moon or the position of the stars could determine whether a treatment succeeded or failed. If you think modern medicine suffers from pseudoscientific nonsense, you haven't battled plague-era treatments under the full moon before dawn. Take, for example, the role of chants and incantations. Science might scoff, but these vocal rituals served multiple purposes: easing the mind of the patient, focusing the healer's intent, and most importantly, maintaining the belief that recovery was possible. It's easy to dismiss this as near placebo, but in societies where faith in magic and spirit was absolute, that belief was often the difference between surrendering to illness and surviving it. Better to recite a spell and sip a bitter potion than to lie helpless, paralyzed by fear and despair. And fear was a real adversary. Illness didn't just threaten the body, it threatened identity, social bonds, even the future of entire tribes or villages. Envision a small community where every life matters for survival. Losing someone to sickness wasn't just personal tragedy, it was community catastrophe. So the stakes of healing were sky high. The healer had to be more than a plant expert. They had to be a spiritual warrior, a psychotherapist, a wise counselor, and sometimes even a shamanistic exorcist. These roles had their own hierarchies and social dynamics. Some were born into their positions, inheriting secret knowledge passed down through generations, while others were chosen by visions or calls from the spirit world. Failure wasn't just understood as ineffective medicine, it was often interpreted as a failure of faith or spiritual corruption. This could be deadly for the healer's reputation or life. Magic and medicine here melded into an inseparable whole. It provokes a rather jarring thought. What if modern science, with all its clinical precision, still has something to learn from this ancient blend of body, mind, and spirit. No, I'm not suggesting you swallow magic beans or start chanting to cure your cold, but beneath the smoke and feathers was a sophisticated understanding born of long observation and practical necessity. For instance, many herbal remedies used by ancient shamans turned out to contain active pharmaceutical compounds. Willow bark's pain-relieving properties eventually gave us aspirin. Garlic, used in ancient spells to ward off evil, is now known to have antimicrobial effects. The difference? Those early healers didn't separate the chemical from the spiritual. They were one and the same. These healers operated in a world where science and superstition debated fiercely, but dialogue was impossible. Magic was real, and so were the consequences of illness and death. Power was borrowed from unseen realms, and so the line between healing and harming was razor thin. A poorly timed chant, a misapplied potion, or a neglected but vital ritual could turn the tide from recovery to demise. Still, the resilience of these ancient healers is remarkable. Imagine carrying the weight of lives and souls on your shoulders, armed only with fragments of knowledge, moon phases, and mythic assurances. Yet that was the reality, and for many, the only hope. In a world where science was yet to unfold its wings, magic filled the vacuum of uncertainty, bolstering spirits and weaving the fragile fabric that held communities together through plague, famine, and endless hardship. Reflect on this. While we now trust microscopes and pharmaceutical trials, those early healers dared to confront disease with the weapons available, roots sharp as daggers, chants loud as thunder, and an unyielding faith in something greater. In their hands, healing was not just treatment. It was a performance of hope, a battle for life waged on both earthly and ethereal fronts. So next time you reach for that bottle of vitamins or scroll through a health blog, spare a thought for the shamans and medicine women who once held our ancestors' lives in trembling hands, battling unseen demons with the faint glimmer of magic and hope. Because in the endless fight against illness, sometimes belief is the best remedy of all. Imagine a world where simply catching a cold could feel like rolling the dice with fate. A sneeze wasn't a minor inconvenience. It might have been the prelude to something far more sinister. Life in the early ages of history was a brutal balancing act between surviving and succumbing to relentless tides of disease, infant deaths, and a complete absence of the medical safety nets we so casually rely on today. Forget antibiotics or vaccines, or even the concept of germs. Instead, people faced sickness armed mostly with hope, superstition, and an impressive assortment of herbs that sometimes worked and just as often did nothing but fill the air with strange scents. The reality, life expectancy, was grim. Really grim. If you were lucky enough to escape the deadly gauntlet of childbirth and those first fragile years, you might still find yourself trapped in a world where the average age hovered somewhere between still barely a teenager and early 30s. Yes, the odds were that unforgiving. Many people never made it past their childhood or the precarious onset of adulthood, victims of maladies now easily controlled or cured. But back then, every cough or fever was a potential death sentence. Diseases ran rampant. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis. Words that sound like daring, exotic creatures today were terrifying specters back then, lurking in village alleys, market squares, and even noble courts. No one was safe. And worse, no one really understood why these invisible invaders struck. Was it the wrath of angry gods? Poisonous miasms filtered through the air? Witchcraft? People grasped for answers in a world wilting under uncertainty. Now consider infant mortality, the grim beast hovering over every household. The soft, precious bundle of joy brought home with smiles and hope often became a tally mark in the ledger of lives lost too soon. In some places, as many as half of all children never reached their 5th birthday. Contrast that with today's global infant mortality rates, which hover in the low single digits per 1,000 births in much of the world. Back then, parents lived with an ever-present dread that their children might vanish overnight, victims of invisible forces that modern medicine would later reveal as bacteria or viruses. And yet, how did communities respond to these relentless waves of suffering? Did they curl up in despair? Not quite. Instead, they stitched together coping mechanisms woven from threads of magic, ritual, and a surprisingly pragmatic relationship with the natural world. If your neighbor's son fell ill with a fever no one could explain, an herbalist might be summoned. The village's own pharmacist and exorcist rolled into one. These herbal remedies were both a lifeline and a gamble. Some herbs had genuine medicinal qualities. Willow bark, for instance, contained salicin, a precursor to aspirin, soothing fevers and pains long before scientists identified its chemical properties. But much of it was guesswork, or tradition passed down in whispered instructions from one generation to the next. Dandelion leaves, nettle teas, garlic cloves fashioned into amulets, and mysterious poultices of unknown composition, often accompanied by incantations or prayers. Because, let's face it, if the bear's bile didn't fix you, maybe the charm would. This blend of the empirical with the mystical speaks volumes about the emotional landscape of these communities. Fear was omnipresent. but so was hope. Facing death daily, people grasped at any thread that offered a chance of survival, whether natural or supernatural. Illness was as much a spiritual battle as a physical one. Interestingly, this uncertainty didn't just fuel desperation, it shaped society's very fabric. Burial customs, for example, were lined with rituals to prevent the dead from returning as malevolent spirits, as people genuinely feared that the afflicted might haunt the living if not properly laid to rest. Quarantines, the ancient equivalents of our health lockdowns, were applied sporadically and often ineffectively, but they reveal an intuitive understanding. Sickness spreads, and it can be contained, sometimes at least. Such was the fragile web of early medical knowledge and folk beliefs. The line between healer and shaman often blurred, as did the boundary between science and superstition. But beneath it all, there was an undeniable courage. Facing death without the armor of modern medicine required a mindset that accepted risk and defied despair. Think about it like wandering blindfolded through a maze filled with sneaks, where every twist could lead to a dead end. The people navigating these hazards did so armed with smell, sound, touch, and sprinkled doses of trial and error knowledge, handed down like precious heirlooms. It's hard not to admire that resilience, and even harder not to be grateful for the progress that makes our modern fevers feel like mere annoyances. In the end, the dance between life and death during these times was as much about communal strength and shared rituals as it was about the mountains of suffering endured silently. Communities were knit tightly together by the shared experience of illness and loss. Their stories, passed down not only as warnings, but also as blessings, remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity clings stubbornly to hope. Whether painted in the vivid colors of magic or the slow but steady light of emerging science. Imagine living in a world where falling ill meant wrestling with invisible demons, malevolent spirits, or curses tossed over your crook of barley. Before anyone dared to question the whims of fate or gods, humans grasped at what they knew best: nature. Plants, roots, and herbs were the closest allies, a bridge between humble observation and mystic hope. But somewhere in the dusty corridors of ancient Greece, a quieter revolution stood. No, it wasn't thunderous or flashy. It did not come clad in robes embroidered with gold, nor was it delivered by oracles in delirium. It was born from the tall, lean figure of a man who dared not just to heal, but to understand: Hippocrates. The name alone conjures up an image of wisdom etched in stone. Picture him, a man wholly unlike the snake oil salesmen and charlatans of his time, not shouting and peddling potions, but sitting down with a calm assessment of the sick. Hippocrates did something truly revolutionary. He looked for patterns. Suddenly, illness wasn't some mysterious punishment, but a set of symptoms telling a story. He championed observation with a clinical eye that could rival any modern doctor's. The Hippocratic corpus, a collection of texts attributed to him and his followers, offers not magical incantations, but detailed case studies, dietary recommendations, and prognostic insights. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about gentler bedside manners or philosophical ponderings. Hippocrates essentially handed medicine an instruction manual, and it did so without invoking the wrath of angry gods or invisible witches. Imagine the leap, shifting from blaming the warlocks and demons to charting bodily humors and natural causes. He introduced the humoral theory, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, balancing the body's internal climate, much like you might balance the settings on a complicated espresso machine. Too much of one thing, and the whole system spills over. Yet, as brilliant as he was, Hippocrates was still tethered to the limitations of his era. For instance, bloodletting emerged as a favored technique, unleashing hours upon hours of draining red stuff under the assumption that sickness was caused by too much blood or phlegm jammed up like a traffic jam on the body's expressways. Today, that sounds downright terrifying, like some medieval biohacking experiment gone wrong. But to his contemporaries, it was the cutting edge of science. Moving along the winding trail of ancient healthcare, we arrive at Dioscorides. Here's a name that fascinates herbal enthusiasts and botanists alike, because he cataloged the natural pharmacy of the ancients like he was writing the original Amazon product listing, but without the flashy marketing gimmicks or customer reviews. His De Materia Medica spans hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products, described with the precision and curiosity of a detective scrutinizing clues. Unlike many before him who mixed concoctions with prayers and superstition, Dioscorides sought to classify and describe based on repeated use and observed effect. Imagine an ancient shopper flipping through his 5-volume encyclopedia, trying to find that perfect cure for a pesky cough or a stubborn rash. He didn't just name plants, he detailed preparation methods, dosages with surprising accuracy, and even warned against toxic pitfalls. This was no mere herbal almanac. It was the backbone of Western pharmacology for over 1,500 years. People in dusty monasteries, medieval apothecaries, and Renaissance scholars all owed a quiet debt to Dioscorides' laborious notes. Still, as methodical as he was, the boundaries between healing and guesswork remained porous. Herbal medicine had not yet been fully liberated from the fog of superstition. The fact that something had worked once or twice wasn't rigorous proof, and the placebo effect had many powerful allies in the form of ritual, ceremony, and, frankly, human hope. Finally, enter Galen. a towering figure of ancient medicine whose influence arguably rivals even Hippocrates. Galen's approach mixed philosophy, anatomy, and herbal remedies with the gusto of a man who believed science could be as elegant as a finely tuned lyre. His dissections, mostly on animals, provided new insights into how the body functioned, and he relentlessly refined the humoral theory, adding layers of complexity and structure. His words became gospel. Doctors for centuries quoted Galen as if he were the authoritative voice of nature itself. But Galen wasn't perfect. Despite his meticulous observations, he sometimes clung to outdated assumptions because old beliefs had a stubborn way of sticking around, like gum on a marketplace cobblestone. Plus, dissecting animals rather than humans led him astray on certain anatomical details, but that didn't stop his teachings from dominating Western medicine well into the Renaissance. What connects these three figures, Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen, is more than just their names listed in dusty textbooks. Together, their combined efforts marked the gradual but steady shift from superstition toward empirical study. They didn't just sniff leaves at random or chant blessings. They looked, they listened, they wrote, and they argued. Their work laid a foundation that medicine could finally stand on, a foundation sturdy enough to encourage inquiry, skepticism, and the pursuit of knowledge. Yet, even with all this progress, let's be honest, medicine was still half art, half guesswork, swaddled in hope and half understood science. Imagine being on the receiving end of treatment in a bustling ancient city. Your doctor might bleed you, give you a bitter draught brewed from mandrake or willow bark, or advise balancing your diet in ways that sound surprisingly modern, yet somehow leave you clutching your stomach, wondering if you're better or just more confused. And those herbal remedies, some were genuinely effective, like willow bark, the natural ancestor of aspirin. Others were purely placebo, or, in harsher realities, poisonous. Medicine was a dance on a razor's edge, a blend of inherited lore and nascent science, tried and true, or terribly wrong, but always hopeful. So, next time you swallow a capsule or apply an essential oil, remember it's a legacy stretching back millennia. A legacy that began when a few ancient thinkers dared to say, "Let's try understanding, not just fearing." It was a pivotal moment when hope began to mingle with observation, when magic's shadows receded slightly to reveal the first glimmers of reason, lighting the path from superstition to science. Imagine a cloistered medieval monastery, stone walls damp with centuries of secrecy, faint candlelight flickering over dusty parchment, and monks hunched over archaic texts whose faded ink speaks of cures both miraculous and maddening. These were the quiet corners of Europe where ancient knowledge, whispered through the ages, found refuge in an era battered by plagues, wars, and a bewildering absence of modern medicine. Here, in these stone sanctuaries, herbal remedies were not just practical solutions, but sacred talismans in the eternal fight against illness. The monks were the librarians of life and death. They copied, preserved, and sometimes improvised from collections of herbal manuals inherited from classical antiquity, texts penned by the likes of Dioscrides and Galen, whose wisdom was cherished despite being centuries old. Think of them as the medieval world's original pharmacologists, armed with quills instead of scalpels, and armed not solely with science, but deeply entangled with faith and mysticism. Their herbals, a kind of botanical Wikipedia, listed plants that could staunch bleeding, ease fevers, or drive away demons. Yes, demons, because in medieval Europe, sickness wasn't just a biological event, but a spiritual battle. The line between medicine and magic blurred so thoroughly that potions were sprinkled with prayers, and healing was as much about invoking the divine as about grinding roots and boiling herbs. Take the mandrake root, for example, a root shaped quite eerily like a human figure. It was believed to scream when pulled from the earth to the point of death. If you think that sounds like a horror story gone wrong, you're not far off. Monks and healers would tie dogs to the root to pull it out remotely, because, naturally, you don't want to be the one to face a death shriek yourself. Mandrake was prized not just for its anesthetic properties, but for its supposed magical potency to ward off evil spirits. A literal mix of pharmacology and folklore, all rolled into one powerful, terrifying root. But the duality didn't stop there. Monks would meticulously prepare salves infused with herbs like yarrow, sage, and St. John's wort, carefully following tested recipes that promised to heal wounds or calm fevers. Yet, as they rubbed these ointments onto skin or brewed bitter infusions, they would often chant prayers or inscribe crosses on the afflicted, weaving spiritual protection into physical treatment. Medicine was a holistic act of hope, science, and superstition, a balancing act in a world where understanding of disease was minimal and explanations often supernatural. Interestingly, the monasteries were also the main centers where empirical observations took root, albeit slowly. If a herb consistently worked or didn't, monks took note. Their herbal texts occasionally updated as discoveries were passed down. This was early science in its awkward toddler steps, tied firmly to religious tradition. You might say it was like a lab where you can only experiment so far before the divine gets involved to seal the deal. In fact, the reliance on prayer and ritual wasn't just about comforting the sick. It reflected an entrenched worldview: illness as punishment, a test of faith, or an invasion by malignant spirits. Medical interventions often came with incantations, holy water, or relics believed to carry miraculous healing power. The physical and spiritual were inseparable in this fight for body and soul. What's striking is how this intertwining of magic and medicine wasn't mere credulity or ignorance. It was a working system of care, forged in brutal realities, when survival was a daily lottery. Before antibiotics or germ carry, these herbal salves and prayers were the best medicine available. And sometimes they worked. Willow bark, known today for containing aspirin, eased pain and fever. Honey served as an antiseptic. The monks didn't know why these remedies worked any more than they understood contagion. But in a world without microscopes, tangible results were miracles sufficient enough. Yet, despite their best intentions and diligent efforts, lifespan in medieval Europe was notoriously short. Infant mortality, plague outbreaks, and chronic famine meant that many never lived past their 40s. Herbal remedies were often palliative at best, a balm against suffering rather than a cure. The difference between a few more years and an early grave could hinge on a lucky dose of mugwort or saint's relic rather than real medicine as we know it. This blend of hope, ritual, and patchwork science reveals a poignant truth about the era. People did not merely endure illness, they actively battled it with every tool at their disposal, be it a mortar and pestle, a whispered prayer, or a holy symbol. Healing was as much a spiritual conquest as a physical one, a testament to human resilience and imagination faced with an often merciless reality. Between the flickering candles and the shadowed cloisters, medieval herbalists navigated a delicate dance. They preserved precious ancient wisdom, grappled with their own observations, and embraced the mysterious forces unseen but deeply felt. Far from being backward or naive, this was a complex, adaptive system of care, a bridge between the magical and the scientific, between superstition and the nascent stirrings of evidence-based practice. So, next time you reach for a cup of chamomile tea or marvel at the humble virtues of lavender, remember that the roots of herbal medicine stretch back to these monastic sanctuaries, where faith and formic acid mixed under the watchful eyes of praying monks. And remember, too, in that ancient struggle to stave off death, often the sharpest medicine was hope itself. Imagine a world where sickness isn't just an unlucky break of your body's plumbing, but a cosmic disturbance, a rift in the delicate fabric of your very existence. That's the starting point for two of the oldest living medical traditions on Earth, Ayurveda from ancient India and traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, from, well, China. Both systems emerged thousands of years ago, before microscopes, before antibiotics, before the ability to Google your symptoms and freak out about every weird bump. Instead, they offered a profoundly holistic approach, blending philosophy, observation, and a hefty dose of herbal wizardry to fend off the ever-present specter of illness. Let's dive into Ayurveda first, which literally means the signs of life. Picture yourself in the lush landscapes of the Indian subcontinent, where rivers snake through vibrant forests and monsoons drench the earth in life-giving water. Here, health wasn't just about fixing what was broken, but about achieving balance, specifically among the three doshas. These aren't the latest yoga poses, they're fundamental bodily forces known as Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, each representing air and ether, fire and water, earth and water, respectively. The Ayurvedic idea, everyone is a unique blend of these doshas, and disease creeps in when this balance is upset. Too much Pitta, and maybe you're hot-tempered with indigestion. Too much Kapha, and you might feel sluggish or congested. Now, what did they do about it? Enter a botanical arsenal so vast it would make any modern pharmacy blush. Herbs like turmeric, ashwagandha, and holy basil were prescribed not just as remedies, but as daily rituals for maintaining equilibrium. These plants were combined into intricately formulated concoctions. Think of them as early pharmaceutical cocktails brewed with the precision of a chemist and the intuition of a mystic. Turmeric's golden touch went beyond just the spice rack. It held antiseptic properties and was a cornerstone for countless formulations. Ashwagandha, dubbed the Indian ginseng, promised vitality and stress relief, a kind of ancient all-in-one energy bar and stress ball. But Ayurveda didn't stop at herbs. It integrated diet, meditation, yoga, and even spiritual practices into its grand vision. Health was a dance between body, mind, and spirit, choreographed by the rhythms of nature and the seasons. Crossing over to the East, traditional Chinese medicine faced a similar challenge under a very different lens. Imagine ancient China's sprawling landscapes, mountains, rivers, and misty valleys, where monks and scholars observed the world meticulously and mapped human health onto a cosmic framework of energy called qi. Qi runs through your body like invisible rivers, and illness was like a dam or blockage, causing that energy to stagnate. The universe, in TCM's view, is a vast interplay of yin and yang, opposing but complementary forces that swirl through everything, from the seasons to your pulse. Balance here meant keeping yin and yang in check and qi flowing smoothly. Herbal medicine formed the backbone of this system as well, but with a somewhat different flavor. TCM practitioners weren't content with just slapping a herb on a symptom. Herbs were ingredients in complex formulas designed to work harmoniously. Ginseng, known as the root of immortality, was prized almost like a currency of vitality, boosting qi and resisting fatigue. Then there were lesser-known botanicals, such as astragalus, believed to strengthen the immune system, and Schisandra, a berry heralded for its ability to protect the liver and enhance mental clarity. These ingredients were steeped, boiled, dried, ground, and combined into decoctions that could be incredibly potent or mild, depending on the patient's constitution and diagnosis. What's fascinating is how these ancient practitioners read the body's signs, not as isolated symptoms, but as interconnected clues in a grand puzzle. Tongue diagnosis, pulse taking, these might sound quaint or even bizarre today, but in a world without blood tests or x-rays, they were the medical scans of their day. A red tongue with a certain coating suggested heat or inflammation. A fine, weak pulse could indicate deficiency or exhaustion. This diagnostic artistry was as much art as science, woven from centuries of experience, observation, and, yes, sometimes guesswork. It might seem curious or even a bit poetic to think of ancient physicians and herbalists as both scientists and shamans. They operated at the crossroads of magic and medicine, where the distinction between the physical and the mystical blurred. The formulations they developed had a dual purpose: to treat the visible ailments plaguing the body and to restore an unseen harmony reflecting the balance of the universe. The patient wasn't just sick, but out of sync in the grand symphony of nature. Now, before we romanticize too much, it's worth acknowledging that life was harsh and full of heartache. These remedies weren't miracles guaranteed to save everyone from every illness. Infants often died before their first birthdays. Epidemics swept through communities with devastating speed. Even with the best care of the time, medicine had its limits. If you were unlucky enough to suffer a severe infection, your fate probably depended more on luck than herbs. Yet, despite such challenges, these traditions endured, evolving but never abandoning their core philosophies. They offer a stark contrast to today's pill-popping quick fixes, reminding us that ancient healers looked beyond symptoms to a system, a living, breathing relationship between humans and the world around them. They recognized that health isn't a static condition, but a dynamic process of balancing forces that rise and fall like the tides. Looking at Ayurveda and TCM now, it's tempting to dismiss some of their ideas as mystical or outdated. But research has shown that many herbs genuinely have biochemical effects. Turmeric's curcumin is studied for anti-inflammatory properties. Ginseng indeed affects energy metabolism. Modern pharmacology owes a debt to these ancient gardeners of medicine who first glimpsed the power hidden in leaves, roots, and berries. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from these ancient traditions isn't just about what herbs to take, but about the mindset, a recognition that healing is both an art and a science, and that sometimes hope and ritual are as vital as molecules in the quest to survive and thrive. After all, when your average life expectancy barely scraped past 30, clinging to these ideas of balance, energy, and nature was as much an act of defiance as it was a prescription. So next time you savor a cup of tea infused with ginger and honey, or swipe some turmeric-laced skincare, consider this: you're partaking in a healing heritage that spans thousands of years, linking you to ancient healers who battled illness with a blend of magic and hope. In a world where sickness often meant a sentence, their holistic wisdom was a lifeline, a testament to human ingenuity, struggling to find order amid chaos. Long before the age of white coats and sterile clinics, before the humble aspirin was ever thought of as a cure-all, healing was a deeply personal, hands-on craft, one rooted in the earth, in whispered secrets, and, most importantly, in the steady hands of women. These women were the unsung heroes of health, the original family doctors, whose medical training was measured not in diplomas, but in generations of passed-down wisdom, and the scars earned in countless tender battles with sickness and death. Their story is one of resilience, cunning, and sometimes sheer stubborn hope. Imagine a world where every cough, every fever, and every mysterious rash was a potential death sentence. A world where the nearest apothecary might be miles away, and the local priest could offer only prayers, not prescriptions. In such a place, healing was neighborly, literally. If you got sick, you knocked on the door of the woman who knew which herbs could cool a fever, which poultice could draw out a poison, and which charms, strings of garlic, or lucky amulets might just keep the witches at bay. They were the herbalists, midwives, healers, and caregivers rolled into one human institution, holding communities together with tinctures brewed over firelight and gentle hands that soothed more than just physical pain. This wasn't hippy-dippy herbalism, nor was it some quaint collection of medieval mumbo-jumbo. These women operated in a complex web of observation, experience, and trial and error that stretched back centuries. Their knowledge was painstakingly gathered. Remember, there were no medical journals, passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, often in secret, lest marauding authorities punish them for witchcraft or for stepping outside the male-dominated realm of official medicine. Every recipe, every remedy was a precious heirloom, a lifeline, and sometimes a tool of survival. Take, for example, the simple yarrow plant. To us today, it might be just a scrappy wildflower, but to these healers, it was gold. Crushed and applied to wounds, it staunched bleeding, a literal lifesaver when the closest formal hospital was an entire day's ride away. Or consider willow bark, a bitter, gnarly substance that seemed made for pain alone, until these women discovered its secret. It contained salicylic acid, the key ingredient later synthesized into aspirin. Long before chemists isolated it, women knew to steep this bark to ease headaches and fever, turning nature herself into a kind of pharmacy. It is hard to overstate how critical these remedies were. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Small children succumbing to illnesses that few today would think twice about. Diarrhea, measles, whooping cough. Yet it was often the female healers who navigated these treacherous waters, offering not just herbal concoctions, but the fierce, round-the-clock care that could tip the scales between life and death. They soothed frightened babies, encouraged weary mothers, and nursed whole families back from the brink with a patience and determination that sometimes felt superhuman. The role of midwives, in particular, embodied this blend of science, art, and sheer grit. In an era when childbirth could easily be a fatal event for both mother and child, midwives carried responsibilities that outweighed those of many modern professions. Their expertise extended past catching babies to diagnosing complications, managing infections, and using herbs to stimulate contractions or calm the mother's nerves. Their reputations could be a community's salvation or doom, and a misplaced trust or a misdiagnosis could haunt a village for generations. What makes this tradition even more striking is its accessibility. Unlike the exclusive and prohibitively expensive medicine of doctors, these herbal remedies were crafted from what was on hand: garden plants, forest roots, river clays. Healing was a right, not a privilege, and women ensured it stayed that way. The medicine chest was the kitchen cupboard, the healer's practice the hearth and the humble backyard. It was a grassroots healthcare system with zero paperwork and a prescription list handed down in lullabies. Yet, for all their importance, the healing women rarely received formal recognition. Their knowledge was often dismissed as superstition or folk magic by the men who controlled official institutions, or by the increasingly scientific but rarely humble medical establishment. And when official laws targeted midwives or herbalists, branding them as witches or quacks, these women were forced either underground or into dangerous confrontations with authority, sometimes paying with their freedom, their livelihoods, or their lives. Despite these pressures, the influence of these female custodians endured, leaving a legacy that whispers through history even now. Modern medicine owes a debt to these women's observations and treatments. Contemporary pharmacology leans heavily on herbs they identified and championed. Their spirit of intimate, holistic care, the idea that healing encompasses mind, body, and environment, resonates in today's wellness practices and community health initiatives. It's impossible not to admire their tenacity when you consider what else these women were managing. On top of healing, they bore the burden of childbearing and family care in harsh conditions. They juggled agricultural labor, household chores, and often the financial survival of their families. Their healing was an act of love, yes, but also a complex, demanding vocation that fused science, spirituality, and informal education into one powerful force. They were the first doctors, midwives, and nurses, all rolled into one, operating without clinics, textbooks, or the safety nets of modern medicine. Their tools were herbs, hands, and hearts. And let's be honest, sometimes their remedies worked better because they involved care, comfort, and the warmth of human connection. A soothing chamomile tea might not cure every fever, but it calmed anxious minds, eased trembling hands, and gave patients a fighting chance. It's a reminder that health is never just a chemical equation. It's human. It's the story of women who took up medicine as both art and survival, weaving hope into places where hope was often in short supply. So next time you pop a pill or scroll through a symptom checker app, think for a moment about those women who came before, those names lost to time, kneeling by sickbeds, pulling herbs from the earth, lighting fires, whispering prayers, and defying death in a world that offered little mercy. They weren't just clutching vials or grinding leaves. They were holding the fragile threads of community life together, one remedy at a time. Their legacy lives on, quiet but unbreakable, in every green shoot that offers healing, in every mother's comforting embrace, and in every small, stubborn act of care that says, "You will get through this." Imagine shrinking down to a microscopic battlefield where unseen enemies, bubonic rodents, twitching fleas, and crimson blisters rampaged through cities and countrysides alike. The Black Death didn't just shatter lives, it shattered minds, hopes, and everything people thought they knew about illness. With death too swift and devastating for comfort, medieval Europe was thrown into a frantic, often frenzied scramble for survival. No doctor's manuals or germ theory to clutch onto, just gut-wrenching grief and a cocktail of superstition, herbal lore, and desperate magic. When plague hit, rationality was the first casualty. No one understood what caused the blackened boils or the hemorrhaging sneezes. Invisible enemies. Obviously the work of nefarious spirits, angry gods, or malevolent witches who had better things to do than Facebook. So, traditional herbal remedies, those age-old mixtures lovingly crafted by village-wise women, became front-line soldiers against complete chaos. It was the Middle Ages version of a TikTok cure trend, but with fewer dance challenges and more plague doctors in bird masks. Herbs became the language people spoke when words failed to ward off death. Sweet-smelling concoctions of lavender, thyme, rosemary, and wormwood filled the air. People believed these pungent fragrances could chase away miasma, the noxious bad air thought responsible for disease. Was there any scientific basis? Nope. But when every passing hour was a gamble with the Grim Reaper, a whiff of hope was better than none at all. Take, for example, the infamous plague doctors with their eerie beaked masks, their noses stuffed with herbs and spices. Think of those beaks as early air fresheners, medieval Febreze against the stench of rotting flesh and despair. Under that creepy costume lay a vulnerable human, armed with poultices made of marigold petals, garlic, and sometimes even viper's venom. Doctors mixed these into salves or boiled them into teas that were supposed to purge toxins, boost humors, or simply intimidate evil spirits hiding in the flesh. Yet, for every herb that held promise, there was a pinch of poison or superstition. Mandrake root, for example. Its gnarled humanoid shape sparked tales of screams when uprooted, allegedly lethal to the unlucky harvester. But it was also prized for its supposed anesthetic properties and mystical powers to lull the cursed into sleep. Like swallowing a bedtime story written in hallucinogens. Who says medieval medicine lacked drama? Alongside herbal mixtures, magical rites brewed just as feverishly. Amulets inscribed with cryptic symbols, recitations of ancient prayers, oddly timed rituals. These weren't just religious formalities. They were psychological armor, tangible acts of control in a world spinning out of rational order. If putting on a charm of dyed rabbit's foot or drawing a perfect circle with salt could keep the plague from biting your ankle, why not give it a shot? Fear, after all, is a powerful motivator. Sometimes those rituals bordered on performance art. Public processions where crowds chanted litanies while flagellants whipped themselves into bloodied frenzies were a dizzying mix of penance and panic. The logic was simple: suffer visibly, suffer divinely, and maybe, just maybe, the invisible enemy would spare you. More than a little theatrical, but when death stalked everyone, drama was part of the survival toolkit. In quieter corners, apothecaries brewed potions that read like recipes for chaos. A dash of crushed beetles for strength, a splash of dried nightshade for vision, and, for good measure, a few tears of a virgin, because why not? The alchemy of fear and hope fermented alongside these concoctions, illustrating how deeply entwined medicine and mysticism really were. It wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. Plague was seen as punishment, cosmic retribution for sins piled high like winter snow. Every swollen lymph node was a judgment, every coughing fit a call to confession. So, alongside herbalists, clerics offered exorcisms and blessings, promising salvation beyond fragile flesh. The dual approach of potions and prayers encapsulated humanity's eternal struggle, fighting the known with science, the unknown with faith. But here's the cringeworthy flip side. Herbal remedies and magic didn't always save lives. More often, they offered comforting illusions. The Black Death wasn't picky. It claimed kings and peasants, saints and sinners alike, indifferent to who wielded the magic incense or the rarest root. For many, these efforts were little more than placebo on repeat, a desperate grasp at straws amid a storm they could neither see nor stop. Still, even in failure, these practices tell us something essential. They show how humans, cornered by forces beyond understanding, use creativity, scientific and spiritual, to push back. Mixing potions and walking circles wasn't just superstition, it was early science in the rough, trial and error wrapped in ritual. The herbalists and charm makers might not have saved the day, but they laid groundwork for healing traditions to come. Long before microscopes and vaccines, before antibiotics and shiny hospital whitecoats, humans faced illness armed with whatever they had: nature's plants, half-understood wisdom, and fierce hope. It's a story of life stubbornly clinging to the precarious threads of belief and botany, even while death waltzed so close. So next time you sniff a sachet of dried lavender or pop an over-the-counter cold remedy, remember this: we're part of a long, winding chain of hopeful flails against sickness, strung across centuries like a stubborn heartbeat. Herbs and magic may have been medieval medicine's Wild West, but out of that chaos grew a legacy: the unyielding human urge to heal, to understand, and, above all, to fight back. And in that fight, no matter how shadowed by fear or misfire, there was always a spark of something profoundly human: hope. Long before European ships sliced through the Atlantic's misty veil, the Americas were alive with a botanical wisdom that rivaled any apothecary in the ancient world. Indigenous peoples, with generations of accumulated knowledge, had transformed the natural flora around them into a living pharmacopoeia, an intricate web of cures, tonics, and potions brewed from roots, leaves, and barks that seemingly held magic in their very fibers. Imagine a world where knowledge of a single plant could mean the difference between life and death, passed down not in dusty books, but in stories, songs, and rituals etched into the memory of the land itself. The concept of medicine as we understand it today, clean rooms, white coats, pills neatly packed in bottles, was a distant notion. Here, healing entwined itself with spirituality and the natural order, a dance of mysticism and observation. Yet, far from mere superstition, these remedies were incredibly effective, decades or even centuries ahead of their European counterparts, who until then largely relied on rather crude treatments, bloodletting, leeches, or concoctions that would make modern chemists cringe. Take willow bark, for instance. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas had long used this bitter twig to ease pain and fever, unwillingly harnessing what we now recognize as salicin, the chemical ancestor of aspirin. The Europeans, upon encountering this, probably thought, "Ah, charming folk remedies," while unknowingly standing on the cusp of a pharmaceutical revolution. This was knowledge embedded in the ecosystem, a living pharmacy whose shelves no imperial decree could dismantle. And it wasn't just willow bark. The Americas were a teeming laboratory of botanical brilliance. From the fiery chilies that could desensitize pain receptors and spark endorphin floods, to curare, a deadly arrow poison with muscle-paralyzing properties that, when carefully refined, would find a place in modern anesthesia. Each plant held secrets that both thrilled and terrified newcomers. It's almost poetic. Plants used to bring death on the warpath could, in the right hands, preserve life in the operating theater. But how did such knowledge spread? The answer is a tangled web of curiosity, desperation, and often brutal contact. Early European explorers, initially dismissive of native magic, soon found themselves helpless against unfamiliar diseases and injuries on foreign soil. Knights and sailors soaked in more than just ocean saltwater. They absorbed knowledge from indigenous healers, whether out of necessity or fascination. The exchange was uneven and fraught with misunderstanding, but it marked one of history's profound shifts. Indigenous herbal wisdom entering the global stage. Yet this was no simple handoff. The silvery gleam of European science brushed the earlier, experiential healing traditions with both intrigue and condescension. Native remedies were often repackaged and commercialized, stripped of their cultural contexts, turning what was once holistic into marketable commodities. The arrival of new diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, wreaked havoc on native populations, a tragic irony considering their mastery of nature's remedies. Their plants were powerful, but they were not magical shields against germs their immune systems had never encountered. Still, the botanical troves of the Americas sparked a reshaping of medicine that rippled worldwide. Cinchona bark, for example, producing quinine, became the linchpin in the fight against malaria, enabling European imperial ventures deep into tropical colonies. Suddenly, the survival of soldiers and settlers hinged on a bitter powder seasoned with a centuries-old indigenous remedy. The global medicine chest had a new key, unlocked by the forests and foothills of distant lands. It's worth noting how this exchange was a double-edged sword. On one side, the integration of these herbal secrets saved countless lives and laid foundations for pharmacology. On the other, the disruption brought by colonial conquest often suppressed or distorted indigenous healing traditions. The oral transmission of plant lore, once thriving in communal respect, faced erosion as Christian missionaries and colonial authorities condemned native practices as pagan or witchcraft. Imagine centuries of herbal knowledge gathered through trial, error, and intimate connection with the land, swept away like dry leaves under the boot of empire. And yet, these herbal traditions persist. The echoes of what the Americas taught the world continue to hum in modern medicine's background, sometimes more obviously than others. When you pop that aspirin or reach for a quinine treatment, you're holding a botanical legacy born in wild forests and tended gardens, passed lovingly from healer to healer across generations and continents. So, the story of herbal remedies in the Americas is a tale of hope and hardship, of life wrested from the soil against the ever-looming shadow of death. It's about people who, without microscopes or sterile labs, untangled nature's secrets with keen eyes and patient hands, turning bitter barks and vibrant leaves into lifelines. The magic here was real, rooted in observation, respect, and a practical understanding of the world's complexity. It reshaped medicine, challenging old-world assumptions and reminding us that sometimes the best cure is growing quietly in the ground beneath our feet. For centuries, the line between magic and medicine was as blurry as a medieval apothecary's tincture soaked in mysterious herbs and arcane symbols. Alchemy, the mystical art often caricatured as proto-science, carried out by men in pointy hats, mixing dragon's blood and moon dust, was in reality a far more complex and oddly practical pursuit. Beneath the smoke and mirrors of turning lead into gold or discovering the elixir of life, alchemy slowly gave birth to something rather more down-to-earth, the pharmacy. Imagine a dimly lit back room, cluttered with shelves, groaning under jars filled with exotic roots, powdered gems, and obscure minerals. Here, the apothecary worked, a figure part scientist, part artist, part magician. Not merely a dispenser of potions, they were the pharmacists of their day, blending knowledge inherited from ancient healers with the slow advances in chemical understanding. These were the early chemists of health, neighbors to witches and charlatans, holding the tenuous promise of relief in a world where illness was often a death sentence. The alchemist's quest for transformation was symbolic in multiple ways. Yes, they sought to transmute base metals into precious ones, but more importantly, they wanted to transform the human body's suffering into health. The goal was to isolate the essence of healing powers locked in nature's chaotic pantry. This meant painstakingly extracting the active properties of plants, minerals, and animal parts, a process that demanded acute observation, patience, and just enough desperation to try anything. Early apothecaries were as much folklorists as pharmacologists. They operated in a world where the boundary between superstition and science was porous and shifting. The notion that some illnesses were caused by evil spirits or imbalance of humors placed an enormous emphasis on remedies that were as much ritual as they were chemical concoctions. A healing brew might be a blend of mandrake root, honey, and prayers. Another might include powdered bones and a splash of bitter almond. Some mixtures were ingenious, some were outright deadly. Mistakes could be catastrophic, but the alternative, doing nothing, was often worse. What set apothecaries apart and eventually nudged medicine away from pure guesswork was their meticulous approach to preparation and dosage. Unlike wandering herbalists who might gather bits of plants on a whim, apothecaries began to standardize their remedies. They measured, weighed, and recorded. They experimented with distillation and infusion, slowly untangling which ingredients actually mattered. In this way, bedside superstition began to give way to bedside pragmatism, even if the language of angels and demons still crept into the margins of their manuscripts. Look around historical pharmacies, and you find more than just remedies. You find manuals and grimoires, texts scribbled with recipes handed down through families or stolen from far-off lands. The famed herbals of the period often read like a hybrid of cookbook and spellbook, complete with warnings of curses or blessings each plant supposedly carried. Mint was a fresh breath savior and a symbol of hospitality. Wormwood promised to chase off evil demons lurking so deep inside the gut they might as well have been from another dimension. The transition from alchemy to pharmacy was not just a change in chemistry, but a quiet revolution in how people approached illness. Instead of relying solely on priests or shamans conducting exorcisms, the apothecary's shop became the first quiet lecture hall of biomedical science. Their practices slowly fed into universities and medical schools, grounding theories about the body in experimental methods. However primitive by today's standards, this was a gradual dismantling of the purely mystical worldview and a reluctant admission that nature followed rules, even if they were just beginning to be understood. Yet, apothecaries weren't saintly scientists in white coats. They were entrepreneurs in a market rife with rivalry and quackery. Fraud was rampant. Some remedies contained crushed glass. Others were watered down to near uselessness. The grim reality was that many who sought cures ended up harmed or dead, not for lack of effort or compassion, but because human biology is stubborn and honest poison can masquerade as medicine. Incredibly, some apothecaries built reputations on their rare successes, their fame shimmering like a fragile bubble in the morass of trial and error. Despite the dangers, the public's hope never extinguished. Why else fill shelves with jars promising cure, prevent sickness, or even grant longevity? Healing was as much about stories and symbols as it was about chemicals. The act of visiting an apothecary with its rituals of consultation, concocting, and administering the potion was itself an exercise in hope, one that gave patients the belief that sickness was not the end, but a battle that could be fought. In this shadowy interstice between magic and medicine, apothecaries laid the groundwork from modern pharmacists. Their legacy is etched in the careful measurement, the search for active ingredients, and the recognition that healing involves both art and science. They were the bridge builders between the ancient mysteries and the emerging empirical world. Somewhere beneath the layers of dust, alchemical symbols, and tinctures, the raw substance of what would become pharmacology began to crystallize. So the next time you pick up a bottle of medicine, whether a slick manufactured pill or a humble herbal tea, remember the alchemists and apothecaries who brewed dreams into bottles. They fought illness with whatever knowledge, magic, and hope they could muster, and in doing so, they helped transform the hopeless struggle against disease into a quest fueled by curiosity, method, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness. Imagine a world where the human body was no more than a battleground for invisible fluids and restless spirits, where illness wasn't just bad luck or germs, but a cosmic imbalance, a tiny rebellion of the humors, or a vexed ethereal force complaining loudly through your aching limbs. In this strange, vibrant landscape of ancient and medieval medicine, understanding the body was less about anatomy or microbes, concepts still centuries away, and more about decoding nature's secret messages hidden within herbs, spirits, and the whims of unseen energies. Back then, the body was seen as a miniature cosmos itself, a vivid theater where full vital humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile danced an eternal and often dangerous dance. These weren't just weird names. They embodied your health, temperament, and fate. Too much blood, you might be rash and prone to fevers, a walking thrill seeker awaiting a meltdown. Excess black bile, expect gloom and melancholy, perhaps a descent into the depths of what we'd now call depression, but with a deliciously tragic flair. The whole idea sprang from the wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen, whose ideas dominated medical thought for over a millennium, holding a near-religious authority. Balance was everything. Imbalance meant disease, sometimes fatal, often mysterious. But curing it, that was simultaneously precise science and wild guesswork, a fusion of observation, philosophy, and often desperate hope. Enters the green apothecary, a garden of colorful leaves and roots that promise to tip the scales back in your favor. These weren't your average roadside weeds, but plants steeped in symbolism, folklore, and what we might generously call imaginative chemistry. Healing herbs were chosen not just for their physical effects, the bitter bite of wormwood, the calming scent of lavender, or the fiery zing of mustard seed, but for how they aligned with the body's inner states and the surrounding universe. It was an era when philosophy wasn't confined to ivory towers. It was the bloodstream. Take fever, for instance. The fiery heat coursing through your veins wasn't just a symptom. It was a manifestation of excess yellow bile, perhaps stirred up by an overheated soul or an angry sun god. The answer? Cooling herbs like mint or comfrey, paired with barley waters, and sometimes more magical interventions, amulets, chants, or bloodletting. Bloodletting remains one of history's most celebrated medical missteps. Imagine trying to drain your body to restore balance, as if draining a radiator. It worked about as well as sticking a plunger in your smartphone when it glitches. But hey, it felt purposeful, and purpose counts for a lot when you're staring down a fever in a darkened chamber lit by tallow candles. Then came the spirits, both metaphorical and literal. Not content with just four humors, many believed unseen forces inhabited the body, influencing health and illness alike. In some traditions, disease was a curse or a trap set by malevolent entities, or even a test from divine powers. Healing meant not only dosing herbs, but engaging with these spirits through prayer, ritual, or enigmatic concoctions that smelled enough like burnt sage to convince the afflicted something serious was happening. The mind and body weren't separated by cold scientific lines, but were woven threads in a delicate tapestry. Sometimes that tapestry unraveled in dramatic fashion, blamed on possession or soul illness, with healers acting as exorcists, armed with herbs, prayers, and maybe a rusty blade. Philosophy and practical healing were strange bedfellows, joined in a curious dance. For example, the idea of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, mapped directly onto the humors. Herbs were understood through this lens. A dry and hot herb like garlic could counterbalance cold and moist elements. This wasn't magical thinking so much as an embryonic form of chemistry, albeit one framed by metaphor and mysticism. Instead of test tubes, physicians had scrolls and deep knowledge of nature's poetic correspondences. Sometimes the results were surprisingly effective. Willow bark, for instance, long used by ancient healers, contains salicin, the chemical precursor to aspirin. But most remedies were less miraculous and more a hopeful stab in the dark. Patients might find relief simply because rest, hydration, and the ritual of care calmed their bodies and minds. The human connection, the healer's bedside manner, wrapped in layers of symbolism, might have been the most potent ingredient of all. It's important to appreciate just how fragile life was amid this intricate herbal dance. Average life expectancy was perilously low by modern standards, ravaged by infections, malnutrition, and childbirth risks that no concoction could fully tame. Illnesses that today fall under routine treatment were often death sentences. To doctors and patients alike, the mysterious interplay of humors, spirits, and herbal tonics was both a source of fear and hope, a language through which they read the body's pain and whispered promises of recovery. We see then that the story of herbal remedies is inseparable from the story of human belief and misunderstanding. Each leaf plucked, each tincture brewed, was a page in a larger narrative about how people sought control over their precarious existence, a mixture of science, superstition, and sheer will. The garden of healing was as much a garden of faith, a place where philosophy met the practical necessity of survival, and where magic and medicine perpetually entwined, feeding human resilience in the shadowed fight against death. Imagine caravans snaking through scorching deserts and towering mountain passes, laden not only with silk and spices, but with something far more precious to the people of the past: hope. Hope bottled in glass vials, ground into powders, or pressed into scrolls filled with secrets of healing. The routes, the Silk Road, the spice trade, and countless lesser-known paths were the ancient arteries pumping lifeblood into the global network of remedies and remedies stories. These weren't just trails for goods. They were the veins through which magic, medicine, and sometimes madness spread, transforming how civilizations fought illness and death. Take the Silk Road, for example. It isn't just a romanticized thread in the tapestry of history. It was a lifeline where every dusty journey brought whispers of new cures, whispered between merchants, monks, and wandering healers. The same couriers who transported shimmering silks were also carriers of silphium, a plant hailed as a wonder drug in the ancient Mediterranean world, now extinct and probably the original "can't get this on Amazon" item. Traders ventured further east, where practitioners in bustling Chinese cities compiled encyclopedias richer than any modern pharmacy, texts filled with ginseng roots promising vitality and dried powdered unicorn horns. Actually, narwhal tusks, but myth had a better ring to it. But this exchange wasn't a simple, hey, here's a magic herb game. It was a complicated, tangled choreography of adaptation and misunderstanding. Imagine a juggler tossing herbs at multiple audiences, none of whom had quite the same language, culture, or medical philosophy. What worked brilliantly in one place might be seen as toxic or pointless in another. Or worse, it might get misidentified entirely, as happened when the opium poppy, native to the Mediterranean, traveled east and was absorbed into local medicine with both miraculous and devastating consequences. The push and pull of cultural exchange meant that healing traditions were not static. They were evolving, clashing, and coalescing, with some folks willing to pay the price of trial and error, often the ultimate one. Then there's the spice trade. When you think of cinnamon, clove, and pepper, it's easy to imagine them seasoning food and perhaps fragrances. But these spices also functioned paradoxically as medicine, currency, and social status symbols. Pepper was so valuable in medieval Europe that whole fortunes hinged on controlling its flow. But why? Because Europeans believed pepper could warm the body and counteract the damp chill thought to cause many ailments. Basically, early medieval thermotherapy. Looking at it from today's perspective, it seems almost laughably misguided. Traders wrapped in fur coats, chasing a tiny black seed to warm their insides. Yet, this belief shaped entire economies, wars, and voyages. Those exotic spices carried more than taste. They carried the promise of relief from the helplessness of disease. Through these roots, medical texts also traversed great distances. The Greek physician Galen's humoral theories traveled east, merging uneasily with Chinese yin-yang and Ayurvedic principles from India. Imagine ancient doctors scratching their heads, trying to reconcile the idea that too much blood made you sick with concepts that blamed cold or heat imbalances. This intellectual cross-pollination was messy and sometimes downright baffling, but it also spurred refinement and innovation. Libraries, translating houses, and monasteries became repositories not only of religious manuscripts, but of botanical diagrams and treatment recipes. One could say that a medieval apothecary's shelves were an early version of the data cloud, all kinds of information stored haphazardly, waiting for the right combination to produce a cure. Of course, this mix of knowledge was not always a harmonious blend. Rival schools of thought often clashed, arguing over the best substances or the correct preparation methods. A dash of powdered jade might be prescribed by Taoist healers for vitality, while Ayurvedic practitioners might dismiss it as useless or hazardous. The importation of substances like mercury and arsenic as medical treatments is a grim reminder that some of these remedies were as lethal as the diseases they aim to cure. It's a bit like giving someone a malfunctioning smartphone charger as a healing device. You might get sparks, but you'll also get a lot of static. Sometimes entire societies guarded their medical knowledge jealously, viewing it as a secret weapon or mystical protection, which slowed the flow of information. Other times, the opposite happened, and texts were sold, copied, and adapted like viral memes of the day. When the Arab world flourished between the 8th and 13th centuries, scholars collected, preserved, and expanded upon Greek and Roman medical texts. Baghdad's House of Wisdom became a crucible for such exchanges. From there, knowledge radiated outwards to Europe and Asia, carrying with it not only herbal lore, but procedures for surgery, anatomy, and hygiene that seemed remarkably advanced for their time. Some isolated remedies, once regarded as superstition, were validated centuries later by modern science, proving that the past sometimes knew more than we give it credit for. Yet for every medicinal marvel passed along the trade routes, countless herbs and therapies were doomed to obscurity or outright failure. The transmission was fraught with distortions, linguistic errors, and the outright dangers of misidentification. Imagine a well-meaning traveler mistaking wolf's bane for a healing root, or a scribe miscopying a recipe instructing "take a pinch," as in "take a pound." In a world without labels or FDA approval, mistakes were deadly. The hunt for the perfect remedy often required a willingness to gamble with your life. And this gamble formed part of a much bigger narrative, one where humanity's relationship with illness was a roller coaster between desperation and discovery. The Silk Road and spice trade didn't just diffuse goods, they diffused ideas, bridging worlds with a shared obsession, outsmarting sickness. However unequipped they were by science, however fuzzy the line between magic and medicine. Stories of emperors convinced by herbal elixirs, shamans who called upon spirits to aid in curing plague, and physicians consulting ancient scrolls, all converge in the winding paths of these trade routes. Today, when we shop online for supplements and viral superfoods, it's tempting to think we've come a long way from all this ancient herbal hustle. But the truth is, those long caravans were the original influencers. Their cargo more than just plants, it was culture, hope, and a stubborn refusal to accept the brevity of life as final. In the tangled cord of trade routes, humanity stitched together a patchwork quilt of healing that, for all its imperfections, was a testament to our species' resilience and relentless curiosity. The journey of herbs and remedies, crossing continents and millennia, reminds us how deeply interconnected our striving for health has always been, and how magic and medicine often danced cheek to cheek on the edge of understanding. Imagine living in a world where getting sick was like stepping into a crooked carnival funhouse, twisted mirrors reflecting fear, superstition, and just enough hope to keep you coming back for more. Medicines weren't bottled with labels and instructions. They were bundled in leaves, roots, and whispers of magic. This was a time when the line between poison and cure was as thin as a hair, and the battle for your health often felt like a duel between ancient enchantments and the faint, flickering glow of emerging science. Herbal remedies occupied a strange space on this tightrope. On one hand, they were the most accessible lifeline for ordinary people, passed down through generations like precious family secrets. On the other, they were tangled up in a web of suspicion, accused of consorting with witches, tricksters, and charlatans. The smell of crushed rosemary or feverfew might promise relief, yet it could just as quickly smell like heresy to some. It's hard to imagine now, but for centuries, herbs were both medicine chest and magic wand, a source of healing and fear wrapped into one. Why the tension? Well, the world of healing was undergoing a seismic shift. On one side, you had the old guard, midwives, herbalists, and folk healers who read their remedies not only in nature, but also in celestial alignments, spiritual balances, and yes, magic. On the other side, the rise of empirical observation, anatomists peeling back the human body like a chicken to understand its mechanics, and physicians beginning to challenge the old certainties. This was the awkward adolescence of medicine, where the new kid, science, was knocking on the door, impatient, armed with curious questions and a skeptical eye. Take, for example, the humble foxglove. This wildflower, beautiful and deadly, was recognized by herbalists long before anyone understood why it worked. For conditions like dropsy, or what modern medicine calls edema, swelling caused by heart failure, extracts of foxglove could bring miraculous improvement. But the doses were tricky. Too little and nothing happened. Too much and you were as good as dead. The line between lifesaver and lethal poison was invisible, a needle's edge balanced by tradition, trial, and often terrifying trial and error. Meanwhile, learned doctors who were steeped in the formal education of universities, where they pored over the texts of Hippocrates and Galen, sometimes sneered at the simple herbalists. To them, herbs were quaint but unscientific, unreliable superstitions dressed in the garb of knowledge. Yet, for many common folk, these herbalists were the front-line defense in a world with no antibiotics, scant sanitation, and equally scant hospitals. When faced with a fever that burned bright and fierce, or a cough that racked the body mercilessly, turning to an herb-spiced potion was often the only option. But the herbalist's world was not just one of comforting greenery and gentle healing. Alongside the good herbs lurked those with darker reputations: mandrake, deadly nightshade, henbane, plants that seemed to straddle the edge of nightmare and remedy. Their effects could be as hallucinatory as they were healing, plunging patients into altered states, sometimes interpreted as spiritual journeys and sometimes as demonic possession. It's no wonder many healers earned suspicion as witches or sorcerers, wielding their brews like arcane spells rather than medicine. And then there was the ritual, the magical thinking woven into the healing process. It wasn't enough to crush boneset or brew thyme into a tea. The timing, the incantations, the phases of the moon, even the color of the spellcaster's clothing mattered. Healing was as much about hope and symbolism as it was about the physical properties of the herbs. In a world without understandings of germs or viruses, the power of belief was medicine's secret ingredient. Placebo effect, more like placebo miracle. Throughout all this, the growing curiosity of the Renaissance set the stage for a slow dethroning of magic. Anatomists like Andreas Vesalius began dissecting bodies, exposing medical errors held sacred for centuries. Paracelsus, a controversial figure, challenged traditions by advocating that chemical remedies, better known to us today as pharmaceuticals, could replace or supplement botanical concoctions. Yet even he did not completely break free from alchemy's mystical shadow, proving just how deeply enmeshed scientific exploration and magical belief still were. The print revolution also played a key role. Herbal manuals, known as herbals, began to circulate widely, illuminating the properties and uses of plants with detailed illustrations. Suddenly, knowledge once whispered in village huts found its way into print shops and pharmacies. This democratization of information simultaneously educated and shocked society. Suddenly, an herb's value could be debated in scholarly debate halls as well as market squares, fueling disputes over whose knowledge, folk or formal, held more truth. It's fascinating to realize that even as scientific methods insisted on reproducibility and cures backed by evidence, herbal medicine escaped dismissal entirely. It straddled both worlds, sometimes embraced by physicians as a starting point for developing medicines, sometimes condemned as superstition. The very ambiguity of herbs, their status as both natural and mysterious, made them stubborn survivors in a rapidly changing medical landscape. And yet, the lived reality of most people was harsh and immediate. Short lives and high mortality rates ensured that hope, no matter how fragile or fanciful, was invaluable. If an herb promised even a glimmer of relief, it was worth exploring, regardless of whether it smelled more like a witch's brew or a scientist's experiment. Each pinch, each tincture might be the thin thread between life and death, or between human and curse. So, in this tug of war between magic and science, herbs played the ultimate role of mediator, a stubborn bridge between the unknown and the knowable, the mystical and the empirical. Herbal medicine's endurance was a testament not just to the potency of plants, but to the resilience of hope itself. In a time when the future of healing was uncertain and short lives brutally common, it was this blend of old charm and fledgling knowledge that kept the candle burning in the dark rooms where illness loomed. And as science edged closer to understanding the body's secrets, it didn't wipe away the old magic overnight. Instead, it coexisted awkwardly with it, a slow dance of respect, suspicion, and sometimes grudging acceptance. Because healing is rarely clean or neat. It's messy, full of contradictions, and profoundly human. Sometimes you need both the herb and the hope, the magic and the method, to fight the shadows of illness that have haunted humanity since the beginning. As the Renaissance dawned across Europe, bringing with it a restless curiosity and a hunger for knowledge, something extraordinary began to take root, quite literally, in the soil beneath the feet of scholars and monks alike. Botanical gardens sprouted up, not as mere decorative patches of greenery, but as living libraries of nature's most potent secrets. These were not your run-of-the-mill backyard herb patches. They were carefully curated collections designed to catalog, study, and ultimately harness the power of plants. Imagine wandering through one of these gardens in the shade of towering cypress or the fragrant embrace of rosemary bushes. Every leaf, every root, every fragrant blossom had a story to tell, and crucially, a potential cure to offer. Gardens like the Orto Botanico di Pisa, established at a university famous for mathematics and astronomy, or the garden at Padua, believed to be the world's first university botanical garden, became hubs of intersection between medicine, botany, and a rising scientific spirit. These gardens were more than just collections. They were battles fought at the frontier of human survival. A battlefield armed with thyme and balm, mandrake and valerian, culling from nature's chaotic, wild bounty, a semblance of order and understanding. For centuries, illnesses had been shadowy specters, often treated with little more than prayer, superstition, or worse, blunt instruments of misguided healing. But with the Renaissance came a new weapon: classification and cataloging, the twin engines of enlightenment. And who would have thought that categorizing plants could feel so revolutionary? In a time when the average lifespan hovered precariously around 30 or 40 years, and death lurked behind every cough or spike of fever, gardeners and scholars weren't merely rearranging florals, they were rewriting humanity's relationship with disease, organizing herbs into precise families, noting their traits, appearances, tastes, and smells became a form of mastery over the very forces that had once seemed untamable. Enter the detailed herbals, the lavishly illustrated books that blossomed in the 15th and 16th centuries, like some sort of Renaissance-era Instagram feed for medicinal plants. Take, for example, Leonhard Fuchs's De Historia Stirpium, a book so packed with vivid, almost tactile illustrations that readers could practically smell the plants wafting off the page. This herbal was more than a reference. It was a bridge between folk wisdom and emerging scientific inquiry. But let's not romanticize the whole affair. Compiling these botanical tomes was a painstaking, often perilous endeavor. Illustrators had to carefully render plants with enough accuracy for identification without the modern luxury of photography or even herbariums. Scholars, often cloaked in the garb of the church or academia, balanced on a tightrope between empirical observation and deeply entrenched superstition. A single mistake could mean the difference between a healing tincture and a fatal poison. Despite the risks, these herbals were eagerly devoured by apothecaries and physicians, who, until this moment, had relied heavily on inheritance and hearsay, passed down through generations. Now, more than ever, medicine was beginning to look like a science, albeit one still tangled in the weeds of trial and error. The blossoming of botanical gardens and herbals wasn't just about curing headaches or taming fevers. It symbolized a broader shift. Humanity was no longer at the mercy of the arcane unknown. There was a growing belief that nature could be understood, dissected, and ultimately commanded. This was the dawn of a mindset that saw plants not as mysterious entities, but as components of a system. Systems that could be studied, cataloged, and manipulated to serve human needs. In some ways, these gardens were the original biotech labs. Renaissance herbalists and botanists engaged in early forms of experimentation, cross-breeding plants, observing their reactions to different soils, climates, and treatments. The very act of systematic cataloging was akin to writing the first lines of code in a new language of medicine. Yet, for all this newfound order, many mysteries remained. Herbal remedies could be fickle. The same plant might heal one patient and poison another. Dosages were guessed at and antidotes improvised. Without a grasp of what we now know as pharmacology, these Renaissance physicians were stumbling in a candle-lit cellar of shadowy truths. Still, their determination in the face of such uncertainty was nothing short of heroic. By the mid-16th century, the impact of these botanical endeavors rippled out beyond the gardens and libraries. Commerce in exotic herbs boomed as European explorers returned with tales of distant flora thought to hold miraculous powers. Cinchona bark from South America, for example, destined to become a cornerstone in the fight against malaria. The Renaissance botanical garden was now a stage upon which the global drama of medicine and exploration began to unfold. And so, this era marked a critical turning point. The botanical garden was no longer just a status symbol for aristocrats or a meditative retreat for monks. It became a testament to the restless human spirit, a living monument to the hope that someday the mysteries of illness would be unraveled and more lives would stretch beyond their all-too-brief breath. In cataloging plants, Renaissance Europe was also cataloging progress, scribbling in its margins a manifesto of curiosity and resilience. As humankind edged away from the shadows of fear and superstition, the humble herbal, once a patchwork of folklore, was blossoming into a foundation for modern medicine. It was here, among threads of green and ink-stained pages, that the fragile hope for longer, healthier lives took root, fueled by equal parts magic, science, and sheer stubborn human will. When Europeans first set foot on new continents, their suitcases weren't just packed with muskets and flags. They came boisterously brimming with their own kinda know-it-all medical beliefs. Herbal remedies, potions brewed through centuries in smoky apothecaries or passed down by whispering village healers, arrived with the swagger of a conqueror's army. But as they stumbled upon unfamiliar plants, strange symptoms, and indigenous healing customs that defied their neat little textbooks, a baffling mixture of awe, suspicion, and opportunism took hold. This wasn't just a collision of people. It was a collision of worlds locked in a power struggle over life itself. Imagine a colonial doctor in 17th century America or the Caribbean, squinting at a wild herb tucked away in a jungle or marsh, desperately trying to map it onto the frantic scribbles in his Latin compendium. Native healers, masters of subtle knowledge shaped by centuries of observation, watched from the sidelines, part bemused, part alarmed, as their sacred medicines were uprooted, dissected, renamed, and repackaged. Suddenly, indigenous plants like sassafras, cinchona bark, or sarsaparilla weren't just local remedies. They became prized exports, currency in the new global pharmacy. But ownership, that was a far trickier question. European frameworks of medicine, rooted firmly in humoral theory and the textbooks of Galen and Hippocrates, often couldn't wrap their heads around the layers of meaning woven into indigenous healing, what might have been understood as a holistic balancing act, where the spirit, community, and environment intertwined with the physical body, was quickly reduced to chemical ingredients or dismissed as superstition. The magic was crushed under the weight of rationalism and profit, turning vibrant living traditions into cold materia medica for apothecaries hungry for the next miracle cure. Indigenous remedies were appropriated and commercialized, but the cultures that birthed them were marginalized, their healers branded as witches or charlatans by an often less than open-minded conqueror's gaze. Take, for example, the story of quinine, harvested from the bark of the cinchona tree in South America. Indigenous peoples had used it long. European frameworks of medicine rooted firmly in humoral theory and the textbooks of Galen and Hippocrates, often couldn't wrap their heads around the layers of meaning woven into indigenous healing. What might have been understood as a holistic balancing act, where the spirit, community, and environment intertwined with the physical body, was quickly reduced to chemical ingredients or dismissed as superstition. The magic was crushed under the weight of rationalism and profit, turning vibrant living traditions into cold materia medica for apothecaries hungry for the next miracle cure. Indigenous remedies were appropriated and commercialized, but the cultures that birthed them were marginalized, their healers branded as witches or charlatans by an often less than open-minded conqueror's gaze. Take, for example, the story of quinine. Harvested from the bark of the cinchona tree in South America, indigenous peoples had used it long before European colonizers showed up with their malaria-battered soldiers and colonists. The Europeans eagerly seized upon quinine's fever-suppressing powers. It became the backbone of their conquest against tropical diseases. Yet the credit for this life-saving discovery rarely acknowledged the centuries of indigenous knowledge that made it possible. Instead, colonial powers patented, transported, and regulated quinine as if it were their own invention, commodifying what was, in many ways, a shared heritage. It's like showing up to a potluck, eating all the food and insisting you made the whole meal. This raid on indigenous botanical intelligence also illuminated the unequal dynamics of colonial rule. Medical knowledge, far from neutral or purely scientific, became a tool of domination, erasing native healing practices and enforcing European medicine, served to not only undermine indigenous cultures, but to assert control over life and death. After all, if you can dictate how people heal, or whether they heal at all, you hold a terrifying kind of power over their futures. And Europeans, wielding modern medicine as a badge of superiority, often dismissed native. This raid on indigenous botanical intelligence also illuminated the unequal dynamics of colonial rule. Medical knowledge, far from neutral or purely scientific, became a tool of domination, erasing native healing practices and enforcing European medicine served to not only undermine indigenous cultures, but to assert control over life and death. After all, if you can dictate how people heal, or whether they heal at all, you hold a terrifying kind of power over their futures. And Europeans, wielding modern medicine as a badge of superiority, often dismissed native approaches to illness and health as primitive or backward, despite the incredible efficacy many of these remedies had. It's the colonial equivalent of calling the iPhone just a shiny rock, while secretly borrowing its tech innovations. But resistance simmered too. Not all indigenous knowledge was lost or swallowed up. Sometimes colonial doctors begrudgingly adopted native remedies, sometimes even collaborating with indigenous healers when desperation outweighed pride. The result was a messy hybrid medical landscape where the official European clinics might prescribe a quinine dose alongside a superstition cleansing ritual from local traditions. This syncretism quietly subverted the colonial narrative of medical supremacy, revealing that European medicine was far from invincible or comprehensive. Sometimes it just needed an expensive native booster shot. Moreover, indigenous herbal knowledge wasn't static or simplistic, but deeply nuanced and adaptive. Plants weren't just pharmacological ingredients. They were embedded in cosmologies, cultural identities, and community ethics. Healing was a relational act involving words, spirits, and the body's environment. Maybe you can slip a dose of sassafras tea into a patient, but the cure also hinged on songs, sacred dances, or the presence of a healer whose authority extended beyond the apothecary's shelf. These intangible aspects were non-transferable, impossible to bottle or sell, and almost always ignored or ridiculed in colonial records. The imposition of European medical frameworks also shifted the demographics of who got to be a healer. Indigenous midwives, herbalists, and shamans, once leaders in their communities, were displaced or criminalized, replaced by doctors and surgeons trained in European universities, far from the realities they claimed to treat. This professionalization wasn't just about medical knowledge. It was a reordering of social hierarchies, privileging colonial elites and marginalizing local voices. An herbalist who knew every leaf and root became a suspect figure, while a distant university's diploma signaled legitimate authority. Healthcare became a language of power, language that often excluded the very people whose knowledge had sustained life for generations. The colonial encounter also exposed the limits and contradictions of European medicine. In harsh tropical climates, full of unfamiliar diseases like yellow fever, malaria, or dysentery, colonizers often turned back to indigenous knowledge when their own treatments failed miserably. They quickly learned that healing was context-dependent and that their supposedly advanced medical theories didn't hold all the answers. This was a hard pill to swallow, especially for doctors who'd been trained to see themselves as infallible wielders of Enlightenment science. But nature and disease had no respect for colonial arrogance. The jungle yielded cures only to those willing to listen in and learn. And therein lies the bitter paradox. Colonial medicine was both an instrument of erasure and survival. It erased indigenous autonomy, suppressed local knowledge, and enforced exoticism, all while relying on native plants and remedies to keep colonizers alive. In this tug-of-war, hope was a double-edged sword. For indigenous communities, it was hope that their knowledge might endure, even if distorted or buried beneath European frameworks. For colonizers, it was hope that the magical wilderness, the New World's green pharmacy, offered a lifeline to stave off the death sentence of unfamiliar diseases. Ultimately, the story of colonial medical encounters is a tale of power disguised as care. A battleground where assumptions about health, culture, and authority were contested daily. A continent-dominating system dictated what counted as valid medicine, snatching botanical wisdom from native hands and reshaping it into a tool for empire building. Yet, beneath the official narratives and prescriptions, life found ways to endure through magical plants and stubborn traditions that refused to vanish. The secret garden of indigenous healing, though trampled over, persisted, whispering reminders that health is more than science alone. It's a tangled web of culture, history, and survival. So the next time you sip tea made from some exotic herb or hear the phrase traditional medicine, remember this fraught history. Medicine wasn't just about curing bodies. It was about who controlled knowledge, whose lives mattered, and how the past continues to echo in every remedy and every controversy that fills our medicine cabinets today. By the dawn of the 19th century, the comforting mystique of herbal remedies, those fragrant bunches of thyme, sage, and elderflower that had danced through apothecaries and peasant cottages alike, began to unravel under the sharp scalpel of science. It was no longer enough to simply know that a tea made from willow bark eased pain, or that a poultice of foxglove could steady a faltering heart. Ambitions grew to discern exactly why. What unseen magic, or rather chemistry, powered these plants? The age of alchemy was giving way to the precision of biology and chemistry, peeling back the botanical curtain to reveal active compounds, those molecular agents of mercy and mayhem. Consider the willow bark, a centuries-old painkiller, favored by healers and witches alike. For generations it was a matter of folklore and experiential wisdom. But then, in 1828, Italian chemist Raffaele Piria took this ancient remedy and smashed it into modernity by isolating salicin, the compound responsible for its pain-relieving properties. This wasn't just a neat party trick, it was the first step towards aspirin, humanity's quintessential pharmaceutical superstar. Suddenly, the wild world of herbs, once the domain of superstition and luck, was becoming a field for scientific deduction and measured doses. Of course, this transformation wasn't a smooth march. It was a bumpy ride ridden with skepticism and the resistance. Imagine the indigenous healer eyeing the blistering flames of the lab furnace, wondering if the coldly distilled molecules could ever capture the soul of the plant. What modern science saw as clarity, others saw as an unforgivable dissection, a reductionist betrayal of a plant's holistic power. The very notion of isolating active compounds threatened to erase centuries of accumulated knowledge that blended plant, spirit, and human experience, all woven into the subtle art of healing. Yet, here's the thing about progress: it seldom waits for consensus. As biologists and chemists honed their instruments, they unveiled molecules dancing far more intricately than any herbalist's tea ritual suggested. Morphine, derived from the opium poppy, was isolated in 1804, its potency a double-edged sword, offering powerful pain relief, but also hooking users in a deadly embrace. Quinine emerged as the magic bullet against malaria, extracted with painstaking precision from the cinchona tree bark. Digitalis, a cardiac drug still in use today, was purified from foxglove by William Withering at the tail end of the 18th century, validating what folk medicine had whispered for decades. This new chemistry wasn't merely academic. It heralded the birth of pharmaceuticals as we know them, drugs formulated, standardized, and manufactured to exact specifications. The transition from patchouli-strewn apothecary shops to sterile laboratories signified more than technological advancement. It marked a profound shift in how humanity confronted illness. Instead of charm-laden potions and prayers, doctors now held test tubes and dose charts, powered by empirical evidence rather than anecdote or superstition. Nonetheless, the triumph of chemistry sparked its own dilemmas. Stripping herbs down to single compounds could sometimes overlook the complexity of the living plant's synergy. Modern clinical trials sometimes uncovered that isolated compounds had side effects or diminished effects compared to the whole herb. It was akin to dismantling a symphony to study a single violin note. It might make scientific sense, but it lost the richness and balance of the performance. The simplistic belief that one molecule equals one cure turned out to be a mirage. Meanwhile, traditional herbalists and healers didn't vanish into history. Instead, they persisted, often quietly, maintaining a repertoire of centuries-old wisdom. In rural nooks and city corners alike, the whispered prescriptions for chamomile infusions or peppermint rubs continued to coexist, sometimes uneasily, with the blister-packed drug cabinets of modern medicine. The line between magic and medicine blurred, not always clearly drawn, leading to debates still alive today about what truly counts as legitimate healing. In fact, this balancing act between honoring tradition and embracing innovation became a delicate dance in the medical world. Some viewed the advances as liberating, empowering humanity to wage war against diseases once thought untouchable. Others worried that the cold efficiency of synthetic drugs risked alienating the patient from the tactile, historic experience of healing, losing the humanity in the pursuit of cures. As laboratory beakers bubbled and microscopes peered into cellular depths, another revelation simmered. Disease itself wasn't only a matter of isolated symptoms to be chased away with a single compound. The complexity of human biology resisted easy solutions. The rise of biology brought into view the intricate interaction between pathogen, host, and environment, hinting that remedies might need to be as multifaceted as the illnesses they sought to confront. This new scientific lens transformed how disease was understood, not as a random curse or imbalance to be rectified solely by luck or superstition, but as a puzzle composed of chemical reactions and cellular disruptions. Not magic, but mechanism. Not fate, but function. And as this paradigm took hold, the very nature of medicines shifted. No longer were patients handed mysterious drafts brewed in smoky kitchens. Instead, they received drugs with documented efficacy, frequent side effect profiles, and carefully measured doses. A revolution in both science and trust. Yet, human nature being human nature, even as scientists celebrated their breakthroughs, whispers of doubt clung to medicine's march forward. If one could break down the bark into molecules, what else might be tampered with? Could purity and standardization strip away something essential? Was the embrace of innovation also a kind of erasure of culture and identity? These questions lurked beneath the surface, sometimes spilling into public debates, alternative health movements, or nostalgic revivals of herbal law. Fast forward to today, and this tension remains alive and well. Modern pharmaceuticals owe their existence to the molecular dissections pioneered centuries ago. Yet herbal remedies still command loyal followings. People seek natural alternatives, mindful of side effects, wary of pharmaceutical profits, or simply enchanted by the idea of a plant's gentle power. Science and tradition overlap, collide, and sometimes meld, painting a healthcare landscape that's as complex as a forest floor, rich with both ancient roots and new shoots. Reflecting on this journey, one might wonder, how did humanity balance its persistent hope that a flower or leaf could cure what ached, against the relentless drive to know exactly how it worked at the molecular level? Did we lose something in the process, or did we gain a different kind of magic, one etched in laboratories, journals, and test tubes, yet no less miraculous for its precision? What we do know is that this story is far from over. The quest to understand, harness, and refine nature's gifts continues, caught in a dance between reverence and reason. Somewhere in that delicate balance lies the future of healing, where the whispers of ancient woods meet the humming glow of modern machines, and where magic and science, surprisingly, are no longer enemies, but uneasy partners in humanity's endless battle against illness and mortality. As the 20th century marched on with its gleaming skyscrapers, roaring automobiles, and radioactive fallout, herbal medicine found itself squeezed cruelly between laboratory glassware and relentless industrial progress. Somewhere between the polished surfaces of big pharma and the clinical booths of hospitals came a curious tug-of-war, a tug between time-tested tradition and the cold, sterile promise of science. Herbal remedies, once dismissed as mere superstition or old wives' tales, began to stage a quiet resurgence amid a world obsessed with prescriptions and pills. It sounds almost ironic, doesn't it? A century that boasted antibiotics, vaccines, and breakthroughs that sent humanity hurtling toward the moon still saw millions turning back to dandelions and ginseng like it was some kind of rebellious fashion statement. But why? One reason is as simple as the itch for control when modern medicine sometimes fails us. When doctors throw their hands up at a chronic ailment or side effects pile up like dirty laundry, the ancient appeal of herbal cures, rooted in folklore, layered in ritual, touched by the sacred, becomes oddly seductive. These plants didn't just promise to heal, they whispered hope when science's cold calculations couldn't. Across backyards, local markets, and internet forums, a renewed fascination bloomed. People with discomforts, allergies, or conditions branded incurable shared tinctures and teas, recipes passed down from grandma or the deepest corners of forgotten forest lore. But it wasn't a blind leap into the past. No, this was a hybrid, a curious fusion of ancient wisdom meeting modern investigation. Take, for example, the curious case of St. John's wort. For centuries, this golden blossom was the herbal equivalent of a good luck charm, believed to keep evil spirits and melancholy at bay. Then, in the late 20th century, scientific trials stumbled upon its real magic: measurable antidepressant properties. Suddenly, skeptics had to wrestle with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes these magical myths contained kernels of solid pharmacology. Not every herb was snake oil, but not every story shines with such clinical clarity. The resurgence of herbal medicine also sparked controversy worthy of a popcorn-worthy courtroom drama. Governments faced a dilemma between protecting consumers from dangerous quackery and honoring cultural traditions that saw herbs as essential medicines, not just crunchy lifestyle choices. Regulation and skepticism walked a tightrope together. In America and Europe, the rise of regulatory bodies like the FDA and EMA demanded rigorous testing, manufacturing standards, and truthful advertising. Herbal products faced scrutiny under the microscope of modern science, a far cry from the casual charm of roadside herb peddlers. Suddenly, something as simple as a chamomile tea couldn't just rely on grandma's word. It had to prove its safety and efficacy in double-blind clinical trials. Yes, the bureaucratic gatekeepers were not exactly fans of herbalists. Meanwhile, in other corners of the world, where traditional medicine remained intertwined with culture and identity, herbal remedies never truly vanished. In parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, herbs had not just medicinal roles, but social, spiritual, and ecological ones. Their harvesting ensured livelihoods, their use connected generations. The World Health Organization noted this, not dismissing herbal medicine as hipster nostalgia, but embracing its role in global health, at least officially. And so, herbal medicine, once marginalized as fringe or folk nonsense, won a cautious seat at the global health table. Research institutions began diving into phytochemistry, extracting active compounds from plants to better understand their mechanisms. Scientists didn't just ask if herbs worked, they asked how and why. The line between science and magic blurred in the smoky aroma of a simmering brew. But this coexistence has never been without friction. Modern pharmaceutical companies, driven by massive profits and patent laws, often balk at the idea that a centuries-old herb, free and unpatentable, could rival their blockbuster drugs. Herbal supplements dance in a regulatory gray area, sometimes porcelain smooth, sometimes dangerously brittle, leaving consumers vulnerable to misleading claims and inconsistent quality. The Wild West of online herbal dispensaries continues to thrive, armed with glowing testimonials and a dab of pseudoscience. Yet the public's hunger for natural solutions only grew. It's not just about treatments anymore. It's a worldview, a resistance against the mechanization of the body and mind. Botanical medicine became intertwined with ideas about wellness, sustainability, and reconnecting with nature, the antidote to digital overwhelm. In health food stores, teas boasting exotic herbs vie for shelf space alongside industrial vitamins and gadgets promising wellness in a bottle. Interestingly, modern science also embraced this narrative shift. Research into plant-based compounds now jostles alongside gene therapy and advanced immunology in the medical mainstream. Cannabidiol, derived from the notorious cannabis plant, exploded from a taboo narcotic into a multi-billion-dollar industry, hyped as a remedy for everything from anxiety to epilepsy. The pendulum swings wildly, proving again and again that in the health world there are no permanent winners, only ever-changing alliances between old and new. This 21st century herbal revival is as much cultural as it is medicinal. Celebrity endorsements and Instagram influencers offering herbal detoxes and elixirs can border on absurdity, occasionally veering into the territory of snake oil salesmanship. But beneath the sometimes cringeworthy marketing lies a deeper, genuine quest. People are searching for autonomy, for treatments that honor the body as a whole and respect the wisdom in roots and leaves, not just needle and syringe. In the end, this dance between the ancient and the modern, magic and science, skepticism and hope, defines today's health landscape. Herbal medicine isn't about rejecting progress. It's about reminding us that healing is more than molecules and measurements. It's stories, place, and a connection to the earth beneath our feet. So, next time you sip that mint tea or pop a turmeric capsule, remember, you're part of a long lineage of believers, doubters, healers, and researchers who have struggled with illness and death, with magic and medicine, always hoping to tip the scales just a little more in favor of life. Imagine a world where a sprig of rosemary or a pinch of chamomile wasn't just a nice way to scent your room, but a lifeline thrown into the stormy sea of illness and death. A world where the difference between hope and despair hinged on the wisdom whispered by an old woman tending a simmering cauldron, or the quiet faith invested in a strange ritual performed under a full moon. This was the everyday reality for millions across centuries. Herbal remedies and magic weren't mere superstition, but vital tools in humanity's ongoing struggle against the cruel and unpredictable grip of disease. In an age before germ theory, before antibiotics and sterile hospital wards, the battle with sickness was fought with what little knowledge people could muster. Healing was part science, part art, and a generous dollop of faith. It was a time when the line between medicine and magic blurred, where a bundle of herbs might be crushed into a bitter paste, not only to ease a fever, but to exorcise a malevolent spirit believed to cause it. And the persistence of these practices tells us something profound, not just about the fear of dying, but about an enduring, almost stubborn hope. Take the example of the humble foxglove, To the untrained eye, it's just a beautiful plant with tall spikes of bell-shaped flowers. But centuries ago, it was a quiet hero in many a healer's toolkit. The active compound we now know as digitalis, derived from this flower, can regulate heartbeats, a fact discovered long after its traditional use in folk medicine. Before science caught up, using foxglove was a perilous game of trial and error, yet countless lives were clung to, sometimes saved, by this risky remedy. It exemplifies the way herbal wisdom often danced on the razor's edge, sometimes deadly poison, sometimes life-saving medicine. But it wasn't all potions and plants. Rituals layered over the physical remedies acted as a psychological balm, providing comfort and structure in chaos. When a beloved family member fell ill, often a death sentence, the community turned to ritual to make sense of the senseless. Some cultures burned incense to cleanse the air of harmful spirits. Others recited incantations or performed symbolic gestures meant to transfer the sickness away. These acts were less about quackery and more about control, grasping some semblance of agency when the human body became a battlefield beyond human understanding. Consider the ritual healing practices in medieval Europe, where a weak child might be anointed with consecrated oils, herbal poultices applied, and prayers whispered fervently, all while a flickering candle fought off the darkness creeping in at the edges of the room. The lines between faith healer, apothecary, and priest were often blurred. In times of plague or chronic illness, these figures were the front-line defense, wielding knowledge passed down like precious heirlooms. Their successes were hit or miss, but their roles were essential, not just for healing the body, but for sustaining the spirit. Yet, as much as hope inspired these remedies, the brutality of short lives in history cannot be ignored. In many societies, the average lifespan hovered around the age now considered the beginning of adulthood, a stark reminder that death was an ever-present guest at the feast of life. Childhood and young adulthood were perilous periods, with illness stealthily stalking every street corner and every family hearth. Smallpox, tuberculosis, scurvy, these were formidable foes that herbal remedies sometimes softened, but rarely defeated outright. And in that grim reality, the reliance on herbal medicine and magic was also a form of resistance, a statement: we will not simply surrender to the unknown. Families brewed teas from elder flowers to soothe coughs, applied ointments from comfrey leaves to heal wounds, or sprinkled powdered roots in homes to ward off evil. These acts were assertions of hope and love, defenses mounted against the relentless tides of sickness and loss. But was it all hopeless fumbling in the dark? Hardly. Many herbal traditions laid the groundwork for modern medicine. One could argue that today's pharmaceutical marvels owe their existence to centuries of experimentation with these plants. Each tincture tried and each chant uttered built the foundation of a science that would eventually explain the invisible enemy causing illness. Beyond their medicinal value, these practices remind us of something deeply human: the need to care, to try, and to believe. Healing was a community affair. The sick were rarely isolated. Neighbors, family members, and village healers all played their part. The simple act of brewing a remedy or performing a ritual fostered connection when isolation might have otherwise meant despair. In a world where death touched young more often than it touches any of us now, hope was inextricably intertwined with care and belief. Imagine the courage it took to place your trust in a handful of herbs, in a whispered prayer, when the alternative was grim silence. That courage was the thread running through countless stories not often chronicled because they ended too soon, but no less real. The faith in herbs and magic was a beacon in the darkness of vulnerability, a collective refusal to abandon those who were ill even as the odds stacked mercilessly against them. So when we look back at those times, at the simmering pots, the ritual smoke curling into dim candlelight, at the green leaves and roots pressed between fingers trembling with hope, we aren't just seeing superstition. We're witnessing humanity's stubborn fight to hold on to life, to find meaning in suffering, and to create hope where none seem to exist. It's a story as old as time and just as vital today. That enduring hope, carried by herbal remedies and rituals, is a testament to resilience, proof that in the face of the cruelest odds, humanity has always grasped at magic, medicine, and meaning. Imagine a world where a dandelion was more than just a stubborn weed, and a handful of roots could decide the difference between life and an untimely, painful death. A world where the line between science and magic blurred so thoroughly that a simple potion might have been equal parts hope, guesswork, and downright desperation. That world was our past, draped in a thick veil of leaves, chants, and the scent of crushed herbs. And while the sharp scalpels of modern medicine have since carved away much of the mystery, the echoes of those ancient herbal practices still haunt and inform our understanding of health, nature, and what it even means to be human. It's tempting to scoff at the idea of curing festering wounds with a mix of burdock leaves and a sprinkle of superstition, or to roll our eyes at the notion that a fever could be healed by reciting a chant to the moon while sipping a bitter brew of willow bark. Yet those ancient remedies were rarely just whimsical rituals. They were the original science experiments, born of observation, trial, and terror, scribbled into fragile scrolls or memorized by generations of healers who knew that a mistake could mean the end of a life, and often did. In the flickering shadows of dimly lit huts and roadside apothecaries, herbalists bridged the gap between the natural world and the human body, wielding their knowledge like both a shield and a sword. They knew which leaves could soothe a cough, which roots might thin the blood, and sometimes when the bite of a plant would be poison rather than panacea. These were not mere superstitions, but a complex and intimate language between humanity and the green world that surrounds us, a conversation carved out over millennia of sickness and survival. Consider this. Much of our modern pharmacopoeia owes its life-saving origins to those same wild plants. Aspirin, arguably humanity's most famous over-the-counter medication, was derived from the bark of the willow tree, used by ancient healers long before we'd figured out how to synthesize the active compound in labs. Morphine hails from the opium poppy, digitalis from the deadly foxglove. All of these began as secret wisdom, whispered between plants and people, desperate enough to listen. So, in a way, every pill we swallow is a tiny echo of a shaman's chant and a healer's nerves. But there is something profoundly human in those early herbal remedies that science often overlooks. They weren't just about chemicals in cures, they were about stories, rituals, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might bring relief, or at least explanation. When a mother smeared a poultice on her child's boil, she was doing more than just applying medicine. She was performing an act of love, defiance against death, and reaffirming the belief that nature herself was a reluctant yet willing ally. Yet alongside this tender hope lay brutal realities. Lifespans were punishingly short. People didn't just live to 30, they were often lucky to last that long. Infectious diseases ran rampant, wounds festered, childbirth frequently ended in tragedy, and mysterious ailments wiped out entire communities. In this crucible, herbal remedies were sometimes the thin thread between life and obliteration, sometimes little more than comforting folklore whispered in the face of the inevitable. Perhaps what's most striking is how these ancient practices force us to reconsider our place in the natural order. Today's medical science often behaves as if health is something we can transcend nature, a finely tuned machine to be controlled and optimized with precision. But the story of herbal medicine reminds us that we are deeply entwined with the Earth's ecosystems, a relationship that is older and more intricate than the sterile walls of a hospital. Our ancestors drank from the same rivers, breathed the same herbal scents, and learned through painful trial what blisters could tell them about the unseen world of microbes, toxins, and healing potions. There's a certain poetry in realizing that the same plant someone crushed between fingers 2,000 years ago to slow bleeding might still hold secrets waiting to be unlocked. Modern science may have dispelled many myths, but the fundamental principle remains. Nature is both a battleground and a balm, fierce yet nurturing. It's a relationship we've barely begun to understand, even with all our technology. And what does all this say about humanity itself? Our ancestors faced relentless biological challenges with limited resources, yet they created a rich tapestry of knowledge, blending observation, ritual, and sheer guts. They wielded hope like a weapon, and that very hope, born in the cracking bark of a tree or the scent of a healing herb, was often enough to keep communities alive through the darkest nights. So, as we sip chamomile tea or reach for that botanic supplement, it's worth remembering this. Our quest to heal and live longer is as much about reconnecting with nature's quiet wisdom as it is about scientific breakthroughs. The story of herbal remedies isn't just about the past. It's a living dialogue with the earth that continues to shape who we are and how we face the fragile, fleeting miracle of life. In that blend of magic and science, of ancient lore and modern knowledge, lies a vital truth. Healing is not just a matter of curing bodies, but of nurturing the bonds between humans and the world we inherit. And perhaps, in embracing that truth, we become a little more human ourselves.